Hi everyone, welcome back to Tokyo on Fire. Today is February 27th, 2018. Last week, the Diet approved the reappointment of Haruhiko Kuroda as the governor of the Bank of Japan. This is his second fifth-year term. Michael, this is pretty big news.
Well, it's big news in that anything that involves large amounts of money, and what the bank has been doing, it involves tremendous amounts of money, is by definition big news. It's big news not only for Japan, and not only for the industrialized world, but also the fact that Japan has had such loose monetary policy has been an engine for world growth.
Well, wasn't he one of the architects of the four arrows?
Well, the fifth arrows, six arrows, whatever it is.
How many, you know, it started out with the three arrows, went to the four. Who knows how many there are now?
Who knows? It might be Abenomics 7.0 by now. But whatever it is, at its base, the centerpiece, and perhaps the only piece that matters, has been the monetary policy of the Bank of Japan, which got started under his appointment 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. From that point on, there had been a great deal of anticipation. The stock market had already taken off before he was put into office by Prime Minister Abe, because Prime Minister Abe was telling everyone, I'm going to have someone who is engaged, not like Governor Shirakawa, on a stability-based program, but instead what we're going to do is for an expansionary program involving the three arrows, and one arrow will be monetary easing. Mm-hmm. That, for many people, is the whole story of Abenomics, that fiscal policy has been meh, and that structural reform was always only for show in order to attract interest from overseas in Japanese markets, that there was never really anything going on.
Long timelines, too.
Yeah, but then you can say, well, what about what's going on in the Diet right now over labor reform? And I'll say, oh, yes, that is too important.
Work them till they're dead.
Yeah, but in terms of what has actually had an effect, you have to look at monetary policy.
Right. This is not a cabinet post. This is an appointed position. Probably one of the most powerful people in the Japanese bureaucracy, wouldn't you say?
Well, it's very important to understand that in terms of getting the person you want into that position involves being in control of both houses of the Diet. Most Diet business involving money, the budget, can be done only just with the House of Representatives. In some instances, you also need the House of Councilors, but most of the time you don't. Mm-hmm. But in the case of an appointment, you must have majorities in both houses, so that Mr. Kuroda's predecessor was chosen through a process of actual one person being put up, the one that the Abe government wanted, yes, thumbs down, right, from the House of Councilors. Again, here's another one, thumbs down. And eventually, an academic, Mr. Shirakawa, was chosen. Here, Mr. Abe had what he needed very early on in terms of dominance, right, so that he could pick his own person. And Mr. Kuroda has been a very good collaborator. In no way is he a servant. He's mm-hmm. not like the rest of the bureaucracy, which is required to take orders. His is much more of an equal position to that of the Prime Minister, and certainly the idea of the bank independence, which was established fairly recently in Japan, as compared to other central banks in other countries. They still take it very seriously, even though it doesn't have a long history. And Mr. Kuroda has been very much a collaborator and a colleague of the Prime Minister's. He does, of course, eventually answer to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has the power to reappoint him, as he has done. Mm-hmm. And there's really not much that Mr. Kuroda has done that Prime Minister Abe could possibly criticize. So there was really never any real doubt about him being reappointed as long as he was healthy enough.
Right. What a grueling schedule the governor has.
Yeah, the governor of the Bank of Japan does a lot more public work than any other central bank governor, at least of major industrial states. He's required to appear in the Diet and answer questions to an extent that would just break
maybe 30 or 40 times a year.
Or even more, and then has to go to all the international events and is expected to be there. So the BOJ governorship is not for the faint of heart.
Right.
And Mr. Kuroda is 73.
I'm glad we picked somebody young.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. In terms of Japanese actuarial tables, he probably has a pretty good run still ahead of him. He's made it through all the childhood diseases and everything.
Right,
so
right.
at 73, he's still got a few more good years in him, is a general assumption, and it's not a bad one.
Right. Well, if you've ever met him, he's very affable. He's fluent in English. He's very genki, young.
And he's
Young
got
acting?
he actually knows what the numbers are, and he laughs at the appropriate moments when and he's self-deprecating.
Right.
All of the things that someone who has so much power and so much influence should be. And clearly, the rest of the governors of the Bank of Japan are all now on the reflationary, I suppose you'd call it inflationary side, so that there's a general consensus. There's no real acrimony or even opposition to what the bank is doing, at least internally. And yes, the BOJ has taken on some really extraordinary burdens. It is now has 40% of Japan's long-term bonds, which is an incredible amount of control. And there's always this question, what are they going to do with all these? And if indeed there is not some kind of dark plan in the background to cancel just the debt of Japan, that there are all kinds of doomsday or bizarre scenarios that no one really wants to think about. Kuroda represents, at this point, after being in the position for 5 years, stability and continuity. And that's something that Mr. Abe really wants to signal. He wants at least that part of
Abenomics.
Not only Abenomics, but the entirety of his political program. At least the economic side is set. He's got all kinds of things coming up in terms of political issues. The abdication of the emperor, possible constitutional revision, the House of Councilors election next year, and the fact that he is also, has something to do with economics, of course, the rise in the consumption tax from 8% to 10%, which he swears he's not going to delay one more time.
Yeah, that's a hot potato, isn't it?
All these things are hot potatoes. So take one item off the stove, and that is who's going to be the Bank of Japan governor and what are his policies. We know the answer to both those questions.
Okay, a lot of people might say, you don't know what you're talking about, but at a glance...
they'd be right?
They might be right, they usually are, but at a glance it looks like he's done a pretty good job. The Japanese economy is back on an upswing through a lot of hooks and crooks, but it looks like he has nailed it as far as getting the economy back on track. He hasn't tackled inflation.
Well, the question is, when you promise something that is unlikely, and you don't achieve it, should you really be blamed? Of course you should be blamed for lying. Okay, fine.
Right.
But if it was not an achievable target, as the 2% inflation rate seems to have been, the fact that he didn't achieve it should not, I don't think, be held against him. And certainly he was not the only one lying, and the lie did not start with him, that all the 222 goals of 2% growth, 2% inflation. All these were all in the Abe program before Kuroda came on board. So these were things that he had to nod and say yes, and he has, of course, in some sense, eroded some of the Bank of Japan's credibility by constantly saying, we're about to enter the period of inflation. We're close to the period of inflation. The period of inflation is appearing on the horizon somewhere nearby. All these those are not direct quotes,
right?
But these hedges that it's about to happen and then it doesn't happen. But in terms of the overall view, which includes all the other bank governors of all the other central banks of around the world, his performance has been exemplary.
Right. But he has little wiggle room. He's got another 5-year term, right?
Yeah, but he doesn't have a lot of wiggle room in terms of policy.
That's right. He doesn't have much wiggle room. What is he going to do to kind of support the Japanese economy going forward, especially in light of the Olympics?
Well, in terms of inflation, it looks as though that somewhere down the line we're finally going to get wage inflation, simply by the fact that the number of people who can work in Japan, they're scraping the bottom of the barrel. They're getting into people who are 65 and older. Women seem to be fully employed, at least they're employed at a higher rate than many Western countries now in terms of their labor force participation. There are some reforms that the government did promise, like the elimination of the special exemption for part-time working women, that allowed them to be dependents on their husbands' pensions and health care. That was promised to be abolished so that there be a level playing field for all women. Komeito doesn't want it abolished, and so it has never happened. There's not a lot that can happen on the policy side, and Kuroda, in terms of pushing more money into the economy, he doesn't have a lot of wiggle room, but does he really need to? If there's some kind of economic crisis, it might be a problem, because basically he's been shoveling money out the door, and he doesn't have anything that he can do to further stimulate the economy that really shows some kind of major commitment. If let's say the interest rates were at 5% or 6%, and if you could cut them to 2%, suddenly that would have a stimulative impact. But the Bank of Japan's interest rates are negligible, zero or even negative. There's no place to make some kind of gesture. You can make an announcement, we're going to purchase more, but it's not going to move anything. And that's not going to change psychology.
Right. The psychology is so important. So what do you think is coming down the path in the near term, maybe the next 8 months, that is going to be a challenge for the current governor, that is going to shake up the economy, or maybe the markets, or the yen fluctuation rate?
If I could be able to answer that question, you and I would be much richer men. Let's leave it at that.
Okay, well, you can send your checks here. Current Governor Kuroda is on for another 5-year term. Please stay tuned.